the man known to history as Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on the 17th of January 1899 in Brooklyn, New York, in the United States of America. His father was Gabriele Capone, a barber who immigrated from Angri, a small village just outside of Naples in southern Italy, along with his wife, Alphonse's mother, Teresa Capone, born Teresa Raiola, a seamstress who would have 9 children with Gabriele. The couple arrived at Brooklyn in 1893, having first immigrated to the port of Rijeka in Austria-Hungary, present-day Croatia. Their first residence in New York was 95 Navy Street in the Navy Yard area of downtown Brooklyn. They were hardly alone here as newly arrived Italians. The 1890s, 1900s, and 1910s were the absolute peak of the mass migration of Italians to the United States, with nearly 4 million in all entering the US during these decades, seeking to escape desperate poverty, overpopulation, and a lack of opportunities in the home country. The Capones soon moved from Navy Street to Park Slope in Brooklyn in 1909 when Alphonse was 11 years old. He had 8 brothers and sisters: Vincenzo, who became a prohibition agent, changing his name to Richard Hart to avoid association with his criminal brother; Raffaele James, known as Bottles, who would go on to control his brother's liquor empire; Salvatore, known as Frank, who would also work for his brother Al; a sister, Ermina, who died at the age of 1; Ermino, known as John, as well as Albert, Matthew, and a surviving sister, Mafalda Capone. When he started at school, Alphonse showed promise as a student, bringing home excellent results to his proud parents. But he struggled keeping the rules of his strict Roman Catholic background and would be expelled from school at the age of 14 for striking a female teacher in the face. After this incident, his formal schooling stopped, but his education into the criminal world was just beginning. Working odd jobs such as helping in a bowling alley and a sweet store around crime-filled Brooklyn would come to be his occupation from this tender age. The people who influenced him at this stage were gangsters such as Johnny Torrio, an Italian-born gangster known for his unassuming and shrewd character, who Capone came to admire and saw as a mentor. Criminal influences were an everyday part of life in Brooklyn at the time, and Al soon pursued that path, joining small-time gangs such as the Bowery Boys and the Junior 40 Thieves in Lower Manhattan, after which he joined the Brooklyn Rippers and eventually the 5 Points Gang, the most powerful gang of the time in Lower Manhattan. These criminal gangs were organized, and many had existed for decades at that point. There was, however, no national syndicate of the Italian-American mafia to speak of at this early stage in the 20th century. More a loose conglomeration of gangs in New York and elsewhere that sometimes acted in common interest with one another. By 1917, Al's employer and mentor was Frankie Yale, a protection racketeer and general hoodlum who demanded payments from local businesses in order to protect them, or, as was more often the case, to prevent him from harming them himself. Using funds from his racketeering operations, Yale opened up a bar called the Harvard Inn in Coney Island, where Al worked for Frankie as a bartender and doorman. It was during this time that Capone would acquire the nickname which he hated, Scarface. One evening, while he was working as a doorman at the Harvard Inn, he got into a fight with a local gangster, one Frankie Galluccio, after inadvertently upsetting his vivacious and beautiful sister Lena by insulting her with a misjudged compliment. In the resulting drunken clash, Galluccio slashed Capone with a knife, leaving a noticeable scar on the left side of his face for the rest of his life. Capone was always conscious of this scar, and whenever photographs were taken of him, he tried to ensure that they were taken from the other side to avoid the mark being seen. He also claimed it was a war wound, gained from, quote, a German gunner in the trenches of the First World War, a clear falsehood given that Capone had never served in the war. A more favoured nickname for Al was one given to him by his closest friends, which was Snorky, a name at the time for a smart dresser. Other nicknames he would hold over the course of his life included Big Al, Big Boy, and of course, Public Enemy Number 1. Following this incident with Frankie Galluccio, Capone was anxious for revenge, although he was forced to make a surface reconciliation with the local villain instead by other high-ranking gangsters. Galluccio apologized for causing the scar, and Capone promised not to seek retribution against him, a promise which he stuck to even when he became a mob boss himself. One reason Al decided to reconcile with Galluccio was that he recognized his own fault in the matter and saw that Galluccio was merely protecting his own family. Family was everything to many Italian-American gangsters of this time, and so when Al's girlfriend, May Josephine Coughlin, gave birth to Al's son, Albert Francis Sonny Capone, in December 1918, the only thing to be done was for the pair to marry, which they did only a few weeks later on the 30th of December. May had been working in a local department store when she met Al, and when he married this Irish Catholic girl, he was only 19 and she was 21. Because he was under the legal age required, he had to obtain the consent of his parents in writing in order to marry. Their marriage would be a very happy one right up until the end, despite Al's perennial unfaithfulness. Shortly after his marriage to May, Al was asked by Johnny Torrio to make the move to Chicago. Torrio had been invited to the Windy City by Vincenzo Colosimo, better known as Big Jim. Colosimo was one of the first Italian-American crime bosses in Chicago. Born in southern Italy all the way back in 1878, he migrated from the old country to the US in 1895 and headed out to Chicago. As early as 1902, he was running a criminal organization there that engaged in racketeering, prostitution, and illegal gambling. He was a powerful Chicago figure, but by the late 1910s, as new outfits emerged in the city, he needed enforcers to help him keep control of his turf. He invited Torrio, who had lived between New York and Chicago throughout the 1910s and who had worked for Colosimo in the past, to again come out west and work for him by the Great Lakes. Torrio then asked Al Capone to join him. Al was happy to oblige his friend, as well as make a new start for him and his family in the Windy City. And so in 1919, Capone left Brooklyn for Chicago and began working as a bouncer in a brothel. It appears to be not long after he arrived at Chicago that Capone, who was never faithful to his wife, contracted syphilis from an unidentified partner, most likely one of the prostitutes who worked in the brothel he was working as a bouncer at. This would have major implications for him. Syphilis is a bacterial infection that is typically transmitted through sexual contact. Like many other sexually transmitted diseases, it results in immediate symptoms like a rash or warty growths around the genitals, as well as a fever and swollen glands. However, even after the initial illness recedes, the infection remains in the system. It will often remain largely dormant for about a decade after the initial period of infection, something which makes it difficult to detect, or at least certainly did so in the 1920s. Over a period of years, it is devastating if untreated, impacting many different parts of the body, such as a person's eyesight, heart, and their brain. A severe case will eventually cause brain damage, heart attacks, and kill the person. Capone's case was serious, and as we will see, it, rather than the forces of American law enforcement, would eventually be the true demise of Al Capone. It appears, with hindsight, that treatment with a drug called Salvarsan, which had just recently become available in the United States, could probably have cured Capone. But he seemingly never sought treatment until it was much too late to reverse the worse effects of the condition. While Capone's time in Chicago had started badly in terms of contracting syphilis, things were about to get much better in terms of his criminal prospects. Even while he was heading out west from New York to Chicago in 1919, the United States Congress was managing the passage into law of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, one which called for a prohibition on the unlicensed production, transport, or sale of alcohol on a federal level. The Volstead Act, as it was colloquially known, was passed by Congress in January 1919 and officially became law a year later at the beginning of 1920. Although it was in part a result of decades of campaigning by the temperance movement and the Anti-Saloon League in the US, prohibition was also very much directed against groups like the Irish, Italians, and Germans, who had arrived in large numbers to the US ever since the middle of the 19th century and who had monopolized the bar and saloon trade in a great many regions. However, short of putting these people out of business, prohibition would only drive the production, transport, and sale of alcohol underground. In doing so, it acted as a catalyst for the emergence of new criminal organizations all over the US, especially so in New York, Chicago, and other cities where there were already Italian and Irish gangs. The Italian mafia in the United States was very much born out of prohibition, and Al Capone would soon be its leading figure in Chicago. Within months of prohibition beginning, Big Jim Colosimo was killed in Chicago under circumstances that remain mysterious, though Capone was probably not involved. This provided the opportunity for Torrio to step up and take over from him as one of the leading crime bosses in the city, and in turn for Capone to gain quick promotion from working as a bouncer to become one of Torrio's captains. Within a short period of time, he was in charge of a major bootlegging operation. The primary way in which this functioned in Chicago in the 1920s was to run liquor down from Canada, where it could still legally be produced and transported in many places, though Canada was also experimenting with prohibition in several different provinces over the border to Chicago. The Great Lakes, which form the border between Canada and the US all around Chicago, were impossible for prohibition officials to police, and there was a great amount of money to be made once the alcohol made it to Chicago. Alternatively, stills were set up to produce it closer to home, and speakeasies, the name for small illegal bars, were established to distribute the booze. It was, for instance, very easy to set up stills in the thinly populated Dakota Plains, and then bring it from there to Chicago. Before long, Torrio, Capone, and their followers were making truly staggering sums of money as the Roaring Twenties got going, and people all across America continued to drink. On top of this, Capone engaged in racketeering, gambling, prostitution, and anything else which offered a handsome profit for those willing to take the risk. Meanwhile, life for the Capone family in Chicago was going well. In 1923, Al purchased a small house at 7244 South Prairie Avenue in Park Manor on the south side of the city for $5,500. He also began acting as a boxing promoter, but this was merely a front for his more illegal activities with what became known as the Chicago Outfit or the South Side Gang. Capone had a penchant for the high life, wearing expensive bespoke suits, smoking cigars, and eating only the best food. He also had a liking for female company and was known to wear expensive, showy jewelry. Unlike many other gangsters of the era who tried to stay under the radar, Capone reveled in the attention he received, such as being cheered at his arrival at ball games. The general impression is of a figure who believed that he was a modern-day Robin Hood, making charitable donations from his vast illicit wealth. When questioned about his activities and lifestyle, his dismissive response might be, quote, "I am just a businessman, giving the people what they want," or "all I do is satisfy a public demand." In 1923, a change in the mechanics of Chicago's underworld came about owing to political developments in the city. A reformer by the name of William Emmett Dever was elected as mayor of Chicago. To avoid potential interference and investigation into their affairs, Capone and Torrio decided to move their base of operations to the Chicago suburbs and the town of Cicero, Illinois. Capone based himself and the rest of the South Side Gang there, from where he continued to grow their operation. They set up illicit brothels, speakeasies, and gambling dens, and expanded the liquor operation to supply all of Cicero's saloons, even using bribery and intimidation to take over local town elections, such as the 1924 Cicero municipal elections. This veneer of establishment respectability made it difficult for the North Side Gang, a rival criminal organization, to get to him, and was an opportunity for Capone to not only protect himself from rival gangs who sought to take over his rum-running operation, but to also prevent the election of more reformist politicians. The incumbent mayor of Cicero at the time was the corrupt Republican Party politician Joseph Z. Klenner, who along with his bipartisan administration had experienced hardly any opposition in recent elections, running Cicero by then for 3 consecutive terms. The corrupt administration had been controlled by the South Side Gang, with the help of Al's brother Salvatore, better known as Frank. But in 1924, the Democratic Party decided it would mount a challenge and run its own candidates in the elections in Cicero, mounting a serious challenge to the status quo with their threat to clean up the town. The 1st of April 1924 was the date set for the election, but Klenner had decided he needed a little help to secure a win, and so he effectively offered Torrio, Capone, and the Chicago outfit immunity from prosecution in Cicero if they helped ensure his election. Capone and his cronies were only too happy to oblige and brought in 200 men, members of his own gang, plus men from other allied gangs to help out. The gang began a targeted campaign of stabbings, shootings, kidnappings, and general intimidation to make sure that Klenner was elected mayor once again. This even included an assault on the Democratic nominee for the position of town clerk, William K. Pflaum, on the eve of the election. Pflaum's face was beaten and his offices ransacked. As well as this, his wife was thrown against a wall. The terror continued the following day, the 1st of April, Election Day, when the voters faced submachine guns and sawn-off shotguns at the polling booths to ensure that their votes were cast for Klenner. When their votes were for him, they were allowed to vote multiple times, but those who dared to resist and voted for someone else for mayor were either prevented from voting again or were beaten. As well as this, cars were patrolling the streets filled with Capone's gunmen, and several individuals were targeted, such as Democratic politician Rudolph Hurt, who was standing for mayor as well, and whose campaign headquarters was sprayed with gunfire. His fellow Democrat, the challenger for the post of city clerk, was pistol-whipped in front of his family and his supporters. Then, in the campaign headquarters of another opponent, Frank Capone, Al's brother, beat up several campaign officials. The chaos continued, with polling stations being raided and ballots snatched from voters' hands. Some voters were even shot or stabbed or beaten by so-called sluggers in the street, while one campaign official, called Joseph Price, was tied up and gagged before being battered by the gangsters. Another Democratic official named Stanley Stenkovich was taken to a Chicago basement, blindfolded, and kept there until after the polling stations had closed to prevent him from voting. A police officer was beaten after being disarmed of his gun. As successful as these efforts to subvert the Illinois elections were, they were not without a price for Al and the wider Capone family. One Democrat, a campaigner named Michael Gavin, was shot in both of his legs and kept with 8 other campaign workers in the basement of a mob-owned Chicago hotel to prevent them from voting. When a call for help from the campaigners finally reached Cook County Judge Edmund K. Jaretsky late that afternoon, he sent 70 Chicago police officers, made up of 5 squads of detectives and 9 squads of police in vehicles, to help subdue the chaos and confusion in Cicero. The police response included a squad car, carrying both uniformed police and detectives, who spotted Al and his brother Frank, as well as henchmen such as Dave Hedlin and Charles Fischetti. Straight away, the policemen jumped out of the car with drawn weapons, and a gun battle ensued between the men, during which Frank Capone was shot and killed, while Hedlin was wounded. Al escaped, as did Fischetti, who later surrendered himself. Al gave his brother a lavish funeral. The flowers were provided by local bootlegger Dean O'Banion, who used a florist business as a cover for his illegal operations and cost $20,000 alone. O'Banion would soon feature in Capone's story again. The mourners wailed for the loss of one so young, but observing from a distance were the very same police officers who had shot and killed Frank Capone. An occupational hazard for Capone in his time as boss of the mob in Cicero were the many attempts on his life from other gang members, as well as the threat of arrest at any time. His bribery and corruption of local politicians safeguarded him to a certain extent, but he and his entourage were still vulnerable. Thus, Al was very security conscious. Indeed, in the early 1920s, Capone's driver was found tortured and murdered, and Jaime Weiss narrowly escaped from an attempt on his life in the Chicago Loop, the business district of downtown Chicago. All the while, Torrio and Capone aimed to remain as the largest crime syndicate in Chicago and the wider Illinois region. They faced competition from a number of groups, notably the North Side Gang and the Jenner Brothers. The Jenner Brothers were allied with Torrio, as was Dean O'Banion, an Irish-American bootlegger and head of the North Side Gang. The Jenner Brothers had begun selling cheap booze to O'Banion's customers. Not only did Torrio seem to ignore what was going on, he also either sanctioned or arranged himself for the murder of O'Banion at his flower shop on the 10th of November 1924 by Brooklyn crime boss Frankie Yale and Jenner gunman Albert Anselmi and John Scalise. O'Banion had been known for his bizarre behavior, his childlike wide grin, and a tendency to over-exuberantly slap people he had just met on the back. He had gunned down a man in front of crowds for no good reason, and killed a man he met at Al's club, the Four Deuces, bringing unwanted attention to the gangsters. When he tricked Torrio, who was incredibly risk and publicity averse, into being present at his brewery when he knew a raid was about to occur, an action which ended in Torrio's arrest, it sealed O'Banion's fate, and Torrio ordered his execution. This resulted in a change of the hierarchy at the top of the North Side gang. It was now headed by Jaime Weiss, with the help of his second-in-commands, Vincent Drucci and Bugs Moran. As O'Banion had been a good friend of Jaime Weiss, the Northsiders had only one thing on their mind by this point, and that was revenge. This was the beginning of what would be a bitter 5-year gang war between the primarily Italian-American Chicago outfit and the largely Irish-American Northside gang. In January 1925, it came as no surprise when first Capone was ambushed by the Northsiders, an incident from which he escaped unharmed, though shaken up by the experience, and then only 12 days later, Torrio himself was shot when returning from a shopping trip, the experience leaving him deeply affected. At that juncture, Torrio, who was entering his mid-40s and who had made a lot of money over a 20-year-long criminal career, decided to effectively retire, handing control of the Chicago outfit over to Capone just as he turned 26. There was a further attack on Capone from the Northside gang on the 20th of September 1926, when they attempted to draw Al to the window of his Hawthorne Inn headquarters. Several gunmen opened fire on the first floor of the restaurant with Thompson's submachine guns, firing over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Miraculously, Capone was unharmed, though he was fazed by this latest attack and reached out to the heads of the Northside gang to call for a truce. Negotiations took place, but achieved nothing. Only 3 weeks after this, the head of the Northside gang, Jaime Weiss, was killed by Capone's men outside the very flower shop that had been owned by Dean O'Banion, which now acted as the Northside headquarters. In January 1927, the owner of Hawthorne's restaurant, who was a good friend of Capone's, was killed in retaliation by Bugs Moran and Drucci after being kidnapped by them. The continuation of the turf wars prompted further security measures as Capone began spending more time away from Chicago. It was not unusual for the whole Capone entourage to turn up at a Chicago train station and hire a complete Pullman sleeper car to take them on various breaks to places such as Little Rock, Hot Springs, Kansas City, Omaha, or Cleveland for a week in a luxurious hotel. They would book such trips using false names. As a more permanent retreat, Capone purchased a 14-room mansion in 1928, which he beefed up the security on. Capone also paid $40,000 to the Anheuser-Busch brewing family, the producers of Budweiser, who were in difficult circumstances during Prohibition, for a mansion at 93 Palm Avenue on Palm Island in Biscayne Bay, Miami, Florida. The house was not registered in Capone's name, and neither would any other property be. In fact, Capone didn't even have a bank account. Instead, he used Western Union for cash deliveries. Conversely, he was a prolific contributor to charitable causes and even helped set up a soup kitchen in Chicago during the early stages of the Great Depression in 1930, all moves intended to bolster his popularity with the common people. Capone also used political alliances to gather allies within the political world in a more subtle way than his infamous election interference in Cicero back in 1924. For example, he supported William Hale Thompson with a donation of $250,000 when the Republican candidate for the 1927 mayoral election for Chicago hinted that he was sympathetic to those charged with bootlegging offenses and other breaches of the Volstead Act. He was also an extremely eccentric politician who courted the Irish and Italian Roman Catholic vote and appealed to residual anti-British sentiment in the country through a bizarre array of rhetoric concerning King George V of Britain. Despite his unusual methods, Thompson, who today is viewed as one of the most corrupt politicians in American political history, beat his reformist rival William Emmett Dever and became mayor of Chicago. He continued to receive the support of Capone, which allowed their mutually profitable relationship to continue right up until 1929, when an event, which later became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, was to crack Capone's thin veneer of legitimacy altogether. It brought to an end the informal immunity from police prosecution he had enjoyed through his alliance with Thompson. Incidentally, after he died in 1944, Thompson was found to have safe deposit boxes with millions of dollars stashed in them, much of which was surely bribes paid by Capone. Bugs Moran continued to be a thorn in the side of Capone and was now the leader of the North Side Gang following the death of Jaime Weiss. As well as being competition for each other's bootlegging operations, Moran disliked the fact that Capone was involved in prostitution rackets, as it was against his Catholic principles. The continuing tit-for-tat attacks and killings between Capone's Chicago outfit and Moran's North Side Gang came to a head on the morning of Thursday the 14th of February 1929, the day of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Capone had hatched a plan against Moran, whereby an apartment was rented across the road from Moran's headquarters and the movements of his men were watched. Capone then arranged for a phone call on the 13th of February, one in which Moran was told that there was to be a delivery of whiskey from Detroit the following day at a bargain price. He thus agreed to buy it and asked for the delivery at 10:30 a.m. the next morning at the SMC Cartage Company on North Clark Street, where his bootleg operation vehicles were kept. However, when the truck arrived, Capone had arranged for a fake police raid to take place, with 2 gunmen dressed in plain clothes and 2 dressed as Chicago police officers. They lined up 7 of Moran's men against a wall, supposedly to search them, but when a signal was given, the men were mown down in cold blood. Moran himself escaped the attack, having slept in that morning, despite having been the main target of the hit, but the fallout of the hit for Capone, especially when the photographs of the slain victims were published, was a decline in his image and standing with the public. It also earned him the new nickname Public Enemy No. 1, as the federal authorities now began to intervene in a problem which Illinois seemed to be incapable of handling on its own. There were also many questions for Mayor Thompson. Moran's reaction to the complete carnage of the attack was to break the gangster's code himself and inform the police that it was Capone who arranged the attack. This resulted in a summons to court for Capone to answer the charges arrayed against him. He denied all responsibility and claimed he was sick and so could not attend court. This happened twice, and eventually, because there was no direct evidence to tie him to the massacre, the charges were dropped. It seemed as though Capone's tactics had worked. Yet on this occasion, law enforcement was determined to bring him down, and would utilize whatever means necessary to do so. Al Capone was known as someone who let others do his dirty work for him, but one story persists which suggests that wasn't always true. This story starts with a dinner and a night of drinking for several of Capone's men, including Scalise, Anselmi, and Junta, 3 men who Capone believed had been conspiring against him with another gangster. The story goes that after luring them into a trap, Capone himself beat the men about the head with a baseball bat before ordering his men to shoot them. Still, some historians have questioned the veracity of this story, although it was reported in the newspapers at the time, and one associate of Capone's claimed to have witnessed both the planning of the attack and the incident itself firsthand. Stories like these about shocking violence perpetrated by either Capone or his men working on his orders contributed to a kind of legend developing around him by the late 1920s. He was viewed as a somewhat unstable character, prone to outbursts, jealousy, violence, and erratic behavior. In assessing this, we should bear in mind that he was a heavy drinker and drug abuser. Although we more normally associate drugs as being a problem in the United States from the 1970s onwards, Class A narcotics were traded illicitly as early as the 1920s, with many people getting a taste for using the drugs recreationally as early as the late 19th century, when certain drugs were in widespread use in hospital settings as anesthetics and were not heavily regulated. Capone became a habitual drug user in the 1920s, so much so that he eventually ended up with a deviated septum. When combined with hard liquor, narcotics can result in a paranoid and violent character and may go some way to explaining some of Capone's conduct as the head of the Chicago underworld for much of the Prohibition era. All of this being said, there was another side to Al Capone, one which is rarely reported on. He was, for instance, very protective of his son, Sonny, who had been born with a hearing defect and who Al and May ensured would get the best care possible to try and work around his difficulties, venturing as far afield as New York to visit the specialists there. Capone also had a great love of music, and this ranged between numerous genres. After acquiring a phonograph to play records in the 1920s, he liked nothing better than to lie around listening to operas, and would even study them, writing out lyrics and sometimes even coming up with his own alternate versions. After a long enough period of time, he considered that he was knowledgeable enough about them that he started attending operas in Chicago's theaters, accompanied by his bodyguards. Urban legend has it that during one performance, Al's bodyguards got up to leave during a performance, believing it was over, at which point Capone turned around and chastised them, explaining that it ain't over till the fat lady sings. Whether this is the origin of the phrase is, of course, debatable. His musical tastes were more contemporary too, and he was fond of the jazz scene that was synonymous with the 1920s. This famously led to one of Chicago's greatest jazz players, Thomas Waller, being kidnapped by some of Al's men in January 1926. Waller believed he was going to be killed and was relieved to find when the individuals who had captured him brought him to the Hawthorne Inn that he in fact had only been brought there to play some tunes for Capone's 27th birthday celebrations. During 1929, attempts to bring Public Enemy No. 1 to justice intensified, and on the 27th of March 1929, agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrested Capone as he left a courtroom after testifying to a grand jury investigating Prohibition law violations. On this occasion, the charge which the FBI brought against Capone was that he had feigned illness in order to avoid earlier prosecution. Then, on the 16th of May 1929, Capone was arrested again, this time in Philadelphia, on a charge of carrying a concealed weapon. On this occasion, he was sent to trial and found guilty, and received a sentence of 1 year in prison. Thus, on the 8th of August 1929, Capone was sent to Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. He was released in March 1930 after serving just 7 months, but in April 1930, just weeks after his release, Capone was arrested on vagrancy charges whilst visiting Miami Beach. During his arrest, Capone claimed that the police had threatened his family and refused him food and water. He was then further charged with perjury for making these claims. After a 3-day trial in July, he was found not guilty. The government, though, was not willing to relent now, and so, in February 1931, Capone faced another trial, this time on the charge of contempt of court due to his illness claims. Judge James Herbert Wilkerson made a point of minutely questioning the testimony of Capone's doctor, thus aiding the prosecutor, and Capone was sentenced to 6 months in prison. He remained free for the time being while the case was being appealed, yet there is no doubt that the walls were closing in on Alphonse Capone. Throughout these legal difficulties, Capone was peripherally involved in some of the most important developments in the history of the Italian-American Mafia. These were primarily occurring in New York City and New Jersey, though other syndicates as far west as Chicago had been dragged into affairs as well. In November 1928, Arnold Rothstein, a Jewish-American gangster who had acted as a kind of overseer of the New York crime world throughout the 1920s, keeping the peace between various factions, had been killed over an unpaid debt. Thereafter, Joe Masseria had stepped into the breach as the head of the Italian-American groups, allying with Charles Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and several others like Frank Costello and Vito Genovese. Then, to complicate matters further, another recently arrived Sicilian by the name of Salvatore Maranzano began to try to muscle out Masseria. A mob war followed, known as the Castellamarese War, after the town of Castellammare del Golfo, where Maranzano hailed from in Sicily. In this, Capone allied with Masseria, but he was only able to offer a very limited amount of support. Such were his own legal difficulties at the time. As it turned out, Luciano turned on Masseria and ordered the murder of his old boss, following which he briefly went to work for Maranzano before killing him too, after Maranzano tried to establish himself as boss of bosses. It was at this juncture that Luciano called together the heads of the different New York syndicates, as well as those in Buffalo and Chicago, and formed the Commission to adjudicate over the affairs of the 5 New York families and other branches of Italian-American Mafia going forward, without an overall boss of bosses. It is often assumed that Al Capone was briefly a member of the commission representing Chicago, though in reality he was before the courts in Chicago at the time on serious charges, and exactly who the Chicago head would be was still up in the air. Back in Chicago, as the Castellamarese War was underway, law enforcement, in conjunction with the police in Miami, were trying every which way they could to bring Capone to justice. Around this time, the Assistant Attorney General, Mabel Walker Willibrandt, realized that there might be an orthodox way of bringing Capone to justice. She saw that the luxurious lifestyles of the mobsters were not fully supported by their legal earnings. Many of these individuals barely filed tax returns,
let alone were able to account for why they owned mansions in Chicago and Florida. Mabel came up with the idea of prosecuting the gangsters for tax evasion. That way, they could be convicted without the very difficult-to-acquire evidence of their other illegal deeds and violent crimes. She tried out this approach in the case of United States versus Sullivan, a case launched against Manly Sullivan, an illegal bootlegger. Sullivan was found guilty of tax evasion, though had the case successfully appealed on the basis of the Fifth Amendment. This provided a trial run for how Capone could be convicted if the Fifth Amendment could be circumvented.
The Internal Revenue Service, or IRS, chose Frank J. Wilson to investigate Capone's tax matters, focusing on his spending in relation to his stated income. The key to gaining a conviction would be finding proof of his income and the disparity between it and the amount of tax Capone had paid. Unwittingly, Capone undermined himself when he offered to pay tax on a certain amount of income, admitting in the process that he was in fact guilty of non-payment. His lawyers had been ordered by Capone to get his tax position into good order, and so they declared income that was taxable for 1928 and 1929 of $100,000 for each year. As he hadn't paid tax on that amount, the declaration was in effect an admission of guilt. On the 13th of March 1931, Capone was charged with income tax evasion for the year of 1924, and then on the 5th of June, Capone was indicted by a federal grand jury to stand trial on 22 counts of income tax evasion running from 1925 to 1929. At that point, he was released on bail of $50,000. A week after the charges were lodged against Capone, Elliot Ness, a seemingly incorruptible prohibition enforcement agent, and his team were to become involved with the court process. Ness was a member of the U.S. Treasury Department, which he joined in 1926, working within the Bureau of Prohibition in Chicago, and so he was part of the team whose job it was to take down Al Capone by investigating his illegal bootlegging activities and gathering evidence of conspiracy to violate the National Prohibition or Volstead Act. He led raids of Capone's illegal stills and breweries, destroying his supply chain and leading to an estimated loss of $9 million in income for Capone.
By the end of their investigations, getting much of their information through innovative use of wiretaps on phone lines, the operation headed by Ness caused major financial damage and disruption to Capone's operation and collected evidence for an incredible 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act. Ness now brought forward this huge body of evidence against Capone just as the tax evasion charges were landing him before court as well. It was then perhaps unsurprising that when Capone stood before Judge James Herbert Wilkerson on the 16th of June 1931, the same judge who had already convicted Capone's brother Ralph for tax evasion in 1930 and imprisoned him for 3 years, Capone decided to plead guilty to the charges in return for a plea deal in which he was sentenced to just 2.5 years.
Capone had seemingly escaped with a slap on the wrist, given the huge amount of evidence against him. However, when it came to sentencing, Judge Wilkerson refused to honor the plea bargain. Therefore, on the 30th of July 1931, Capone's counsel retracted the guilty pleas, and an argument was made that a lawyer could not confess for his client, with Capone's legal counsel arguing that they could not legally have admitted the income. Judge Wilkerson overruled the objection on the grounds that any statement made to a government official through legal counsel was done so at the person's own risk. He consequently ruled that the letter to federal authorities admitting his earlier income could be admitted into evidence. Wilkerson subsequently tried Capone on the income tax evasion charges alone, deeming them to take precedence over the violations of the Volstead Act. The lawyers acting for Capone had only hours to prepare for the trial, as they had been relying on the judge accepting the plea bargain deal. In the end, all they could offer was the flimsy defense that Capone's income had been intrinsically connected to his severe gambling habit. This was a weak defense. Not only were gambling losses only admissible as a deduction from gambling winnings, but Capone's expenses showed that money must have been available to pay for the bets placed. Thus, if he had lost money by gambling, then his income prior thereto had to have been even higher than initially supposed. The extent of Capone's spending was then outlined in court in great detail by the prosecution, resulting in the modest conclusion that $215,000 in taxes had been evaded on a gross income of $1,038,654 over a 5-year period. With this established, on the 31st of October 1931, Al Capone was convicted on 3 counts of income tax evasion. A week later, he received his sentence, which was to be 11 years in federal prison and a fine of $50,000 plus $7,692 in costs. As well as this, he would also be liable for the $215,000 back taxes plus interest. Capone's response to his conviction was to hire a team of expert tax lawyers from Washington. They filed a writ of habeas corpus, which meant that the detainee had to be brought to court to investigate if the detention was lawful. The grounds which they used for the argument was the precedent of a Supreme Court ruling in which it had been pronounced that tax evasion was not fraud, which would mean that the time limit for the prosecution of tax evasion might have expired on some of the tax years Capone was convicted for, owing to the statute of limitations. However, the judge decided that the time Capone had spent in Miami during the 1920s and early 1930s should be deducted from the age of the offenses committed within the state of Illinois, making the argument invalid, and thus denying the appeal for both the conviction and the sentence. Following this failed appeal, Capone was sent to Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary on the 3rd of May 1932 at the age of 33. Elliot Ness was among the federal agents who accompanied Capone from the Cook County Jail to the penitentiary.
This was the only time that the two men were known to have actually met in person. When Capone arrived there, he weighed 250 pounds, and at the medical assessment he was recorded as being diagnosed with both syphilis and gonorrhea, as well as a perforated nasal septum due to his years of excessive drug use. He was also suffering from withdrawal symptoms as the supply of narcotics was leaving his system.
Whilst in Atlanta, Capone was competent in his job of stitching soles onto shoes, but he was not popular with fellow inmates, who felt he was both a weak personality, unable to deal with the bullying the other inmates carried out, and also was receiving special treatment. This perception arose from the protection he was offered by his cellmate Red Rudensky, a seasoned criminal who was associated with the South Side Gang, who had decided that Capone, whose health was severely deteriorating owing to his syphilitic condition, needed his aid. Between the hatred he was facing from other inmates, the incoherence of the letters he was writing home, as well as Red Rudensky's concerns that he would have a breakdown, it was decided that Capone would be moved to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary off the coast of San Francisco in August 1934. His new address was to be Cell 181. In Alcatraz, on the 23rd of June 1936, Capone was attacked in the laundry area by fellow inmate James Crittenden Lucas, who was serving a life sentence for bank robbery. Lucas stabbed Capone in the back with a pair of scissors, stolen from the prison barber. Capone was only superficially wounded and was able to throw Lucas against a wall in retaliation. After the attack, Lucas was sent into solitary confinement as a punishment. During his time at Alcatraz, Capone's syphilis worsened, affecting his mental faculties until, in February 1938, he was diagnosed formally with syphilis of the brain. Thus, the final year of his Alcatraz sentence was spent in the hospital ward of the prison, where he was both disoriented and confused. When he was released from Alcatraz on the 6th of January 1939, he was immediately transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution on Terminal Island in California to fulfill his sentence for contempt of court. He was given parole on the 16th of November 1939, after his wife May appealed to the court on the grounds of his reduced mental capacity. Meanwhile, in Chicago, the Southside Gang had come under the control of Frank Nitti, one of Capone's former bodyguards who had gradually risen in the 1920s to handle much of the money flow and operations. He had served a jail term himself for tax evasion. It was after he was released in March 1932 that he became acting and then de facto head of the Chicago outfit. Under Nitti's leadership, the Chicago outfit continued their crime business in a much more discreet manner. This approach meant that it was unclear to many who was actually in control of the organization. Still, organized crime continued, with prostitution, gambling, loan sharking, and labor union racketeering all continuing after Prohibition came to an end in 1933. On the 16th of November 1939, Capone was released from prison due to the state of his health. He was referred to the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. However, they refused to take him in, based on his reputation. He was instead admitted to the Union Memorial Hospital for treatment of paresis, which was caused by late-stage syphilis. As a mark of his thanks, Capone donated 2 Japanese weeping cherry trees to the hospital. He left the Baltimore hospital on the 20th of March 1940 to return home to Palm Island in Florida. He was lucky enough to be one of the first patients treated in America with the recently released drug penicillin. Although it was too late to cure his condition and reverse the damage to his brain, it did help to slow down the progression of the disease. In Palm Island, he was cared for by his wife May. Despite his fall from grace 10 years earlier, his repeated infidelities during the 1920s, and the fact that he quite possibly transmitted his syphilis to her, ensuring that they did not have any further children after Sonny was born in 1918, she remained committed to him and had traveled long distances to visit him throughout his many years in prison. May would look after him for over half a decade after he was released from prison, as his condition continued to deteriorate. During the final years, Capone was examined by a Baltimore psychiatrist, as well as his own physician, who concluded that he had a mental age of a 12-year-old. On the 21st of January 1947, Capone suffered a stroke from which he initially started to recover, before contracting bronchopneumonia. He then suffered a cardiac arrest on the 22nd of January, and on the 25th of January 1947, having just turned 48 years of age a week earlier, Al Capone died of heart failure as a result of apoplexy. He was in his home, surrounded by his loved ones. A private funeral was held in Chicago a week later, and he was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago. 3 years later, in 1950, his remains, along with the remains of his father Gabriele and his brother Salvatore, were exhumed and reinterred at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois.
Capone's death brought to an end a chapter in the history of Chicago. Although by the time he died in 1947, it had been a great many years since he played any role in the city's criminal underworld. Still, his legacy was felt there for many years after his downfall at the beginning of the 1930s. Capone, more so than anyone else, certainly not Big Jim Colosimo or Johnny Torrio, two level-headed criminal bosses, transformed Chicago into one of the most violent cities in North America through his confrontational approach to his rivals and his willingness to use exemplary violence.
This had an impact on the criminal culture of the city at large. Prohibition might have been coming to an end by the time of Capone's downfall, but the Windy City had emerged during the Great Depression as a center of wanton criminality. John Dillinger and his gang of bank robbers operated from here, and it was in the city that Dillinger would eventually be killed in 1934. His sometime associate, Babyface Nelson, real name Lester Joseph Gillis, also worked with his gang out of Chicago. Nelson would only eventually be stopped when the FBI engaged in a full-blown clash with him and his gang in the suburbs of Chicago on the 27th of November 1934, an event so violent it became known as the Battle of Barrington. Lots of others like Alvin Karpis and Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, who went on crime sprees around the Midwest and engaged in actions such as the Kansas City Massacre, when 4 law enforcement officers were killed in Kansas on the 17th of June 1933, also operated out of Chicago for lengthy periods of time. Thus, what Al Capone did was change the very culture of criminality in Chicago in the 1920s in a way which the government and average Chicagoans were still dealing with long after Capone himself had fallen from power. Al Capone was one of the most iconic of the Prohibition-era gangsters. Though he is entirely associated with Chicago, he was actually born and grew up in Brooklyn, New York. There, he was just one of many Italian-American youths who saw that adhering to the law would lead to a life of limited opportunities at a time when there was an immense amount of anti-immigrant sentiment towards Italians, Irish, Jews, and Germans in the United States. It was these same sentiments which, in part, led to the prohibition of alcohol in 1920 as a way of undermining the economic fortunes of these communities. By then, Capone was already a gangster. Having served his apprenticeship in New York, he headed out to Chicago under Johnny Torrio's wing. A decade of immense violence followed, as a drug and alcohol-addled Capone sought to destroy his rivals amongst the Irish-American gangs in the city, led by Dean O'Banion and others like Bugs Moran. His actions were needlessly inflammatory, notably the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, an act which sundered his ties to several Chicago politicians who were being paid by Capone to protect him from the FBI and the federal government. It was this lack of caution and subtlety which ultimately doomed him, whereas figures like Charles Lucky Luciano, who emerged as heads of the New York Mafia during the same era, did their level best to avoid any publicity. This, combined with his contraction of syphilis, ensured that Capone's time at the top of the underworld and his life itself were cut short. What do you think of Al Capone? Was he a modern-day Robin Hood? Or was he a cold-blooded killer and gangster, one whose taste for the high life inflicted a lot of violence on Chicago in the 1920s and eventually led to his downfall? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.